To introduce Dr. Tomasz Sommer. We have been working together forever and ever. I've known Tomasz for a long time. His PhD is in sociology from the University of Warsaw. He's the editor-in-chief of It is the Highest Time, not to be confused with High Time. His publication is libertarian and conservative, is weekly, but he doesn't get stoned, or at least not that I know. His latest project, which he has been at work on for 6 years at least, concerns the anti-Polish operation of the NKVD. Tomek bankrolled himself, and we have made forays together into the intermarium, the lands between the Black and Baltic Seas. He has discovered extraordinary documents regarding Stalin's terror in the 1930s. He's analyzed the documents and concluded, well, he'll tell you all about it. He concluded that we had many things wrong because we didn't read, we didn't have the sources. He's describing, in essence, for us today, the largest genocide in the interwar period in Europe in the 1930s. So in peacetime, up to 250,000 people were killed who were identified solely on ethnic basis. His paper will be highly theoretical. Let me just put it this way. When Stalin issued an order, I quote, "shoot the Poles," in August, during the Great Purge, he identified them both ethnically and culturally, because some Polish Jews were shot too, if they were considered Poles. In fact, when the secret police started running out of victims, I think Jezhov ordered his underlings to look in the Moscow phone book for people with Polish-sounding names so the quota could be filled. It is completely unknown, and Dr. Sommer is a pioneer of this effort to restore to memory something that Stalin bet would be forgotten forever because it was covered up perfectly. Unlike the Cotton Forest Massacre, which came up, really nobody knew about it. The only person in this building, which means in the United States, who knew about this are the two people. One is a Brit, my professor, Robert Conquest at the Hoover, and the second one was Herb Romerstein, Professor Romerstein, who knew about it. But otherwise, we really didn't have documents. And what we had was deductive logic, intuition, and tidbits here and there. This is the greatest peacetime genocide never described anywhere. Without anything else, I'd like to ask Dr. Sommer to emerge from his jet-lagged stupor and roll over to the front and join us.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry for this short delay because of technical problems. Thank you, Marek, for inviting me for the third consecutive time, yes, I think. As Marek said, I was working on this project for 6 years. I'm happy to finish it in the shape of this book, which was printed a month ago in Poland. And this is the first monograph about Polish, actually anti-Polish operation of NKVD in the years 1937-1938. And I would like to present today 4 main aspects of this operation, which have more, let's say, bigger importance in changing the paradigm which is common among historians in the sense of understanding the Great Terror, not the Great Purge, not the Great Terror. So the first aspect is the change in the meaning of Great Terror. In the literature which describes period of Stalinism, it is common to include the genocide of Poles, which took place in the Soviet Union from August 1937 until November 1938, so-called Polish operation, into other ethnic or national operations of the Great Terror, and treat them together in almost all aspects of explanations and interpretation. Complex examination of the facts of Soviet history of that period, presented in my monograph, which I'm going to present today, indicates that this is a manifest taxological error which relies on the integration of completely different events to the same category just because they have one thing in common, in this case, the ethnic character. Of course, none of the serious historians is trying to hide the basic facts, such as that anti-Polish order 00485, dated August 1937, was a model for all other Soviet nationalities' murders. But in the case of any other nationality, that pattern was not used up with such intensity, I can say ferocity, as it was for the Poles. No serious researcher of Stalinism has any doubts that also, for example, German order 00439, preceding Polish order about 2 weeks, was quite different in its nature, because first of all, ethnic Germans as such were not concerned, only the German subjects, the citizens of Germany. In addition, in accordance with its terms, they were just to be thrown out of the fatherland of the proletariat and not murdered. None of the scientists also denies the fact that when, in the end, at the beginning of 1938, the German operation began to be developed in the Polish operation mode, it was still not carried out in Germany's largest ethnic regions, such as the Volga region, populated by Russian Germans for centuries, because they were conceived as our Germans from the point of view of Soviet officials, and enjoyed a kind of immunity against repression, while the regions inhabited by people of Polish origin were regularly treated according to the rules of Polish order, and the term of our Poles simply in the USSR did not exist. All Poles were pure strangers. Finally, there is also no doubt that the number of murdered Poles were by far the largest part of based on nationality murders. For example, during the Great Terror, about 40,000 Germans were murdered, according to the data from Memorial. It means, given that there was officially in the USSR 2 times more Germans than the Poles, that the difference in the intensity of murdering between Germans and Poles was about 12-fold, which means that the nature of repression in the case of those two nations had to be completely different. Quite astonishingly, this situation is confirmed by official Soviet statistics, which shows a decline of the number of Poles in the USSR in the years 1937-1939, and at the same time significant increase in the number of Germans from 1,200,000 to almost 1.5 million. Thus, despite the radical differences in the course and the intensity of repression which targeted national lines, which are so great that there is no way to put ethnic terror in one frame, still in the historiography dominates the common understanding and explanation of those crimes. Even if some writers some scholars see the shocking over-representation of Poles among the victims of Stalinism, they still are trying to throw them into a set of ethnic terror. From my point of view, this kind of taxology is thoroughly mistaken, as the Polish operation should be treated as a sui generis event, radically different from other ethnic operations of the German, Latvian, and the Greek people, as the persecution of Jews during the World War II differed strongly from the persecution applied to the Poles, for example, and the latter from the suffering to which the French were doomed. The phrase ethnic operation is just as wrong as the similar opinion that during the Second World War the Germans persecuted Jews, Poles and Frenchmen, because repressive behavior towards those three nations were completely different. It is quite obvious even for leading historians dealing with the Stalinism, but for some reason they do not appreciate, for example, that only Poles were assigned to organize and participate in an overwhelming pan-Soviet conspiracy, which was the Polish war organization case. Military case. Other nations indeed create some counter-revolutionary or anti-Soviet organizations, but none of these organizations could be even compared at any aspect to conspiracy of the Polish military organization, allegedly aiming at the total annihilation of the USSR and its leaders. This non-existent in reality Polish conspiracy invented by NKVD, combined with traditional Russian anti-Polonism, which was grown to absurd level during communism rule, caused the special treatment, which I don't hesitate to call genocide, which were applied to the ethnic Poles and which was not applied in any case, in the case of any other so-called ethnic lines. My discovery is that if we try to understand the anti-Polish actions of the Soviet authorities started by the order 00485 in the manner it deserves, we should extract them from the other national operations and treat them together with anti-Polish parts in the Communist Party, the NKVD, the Red Army, and anti-Polish actions based on the anti-religious sentiments. Then it turns out that the anti-Polish actions compose one of the most important separate directions of Great Terror, strictly speaking the second largest part of the Great Terror. And the only bigger part in the terms of the number of victims is notorious Kulak operation. The remaining ethnic operations, depending on their scale, should be placed in order of importance of the Soviet repressive actions much farther, as they were much less intense and resulted in a smaller number of victims, and also separately, because it is not obvious that all, whether they were carried, on the same course. It seems that such a change of taxological perspective is important to explain the true nature of the Great Terror, because it implies that the Soviet authorities did not fight just the non-Russian nationalities, as it is recognized in many works, not fought simply with minorities from enemy states such as Germany, Japan and Poland, and such is the other course of explanation. The Soviet authorities did something completely different. In a particularly cruel, genocidal way, they were persecuted the Poles, attributed to them organization of a biggest national conspiracy seeking to eliminate the Soviet Union and its leaders, much less intensively persecuted in the same time Germans, Latvians and other nationalities. They were just spies working for Germany or Latvia respectively, and were persecuted in much more marginal way. At the same time, they were ethnic groups, such as especially the Jews, which were not affected nominally at all, those single representatives of this nationality, especially of Polish origin, were treated just as Poles because the Soviet apparatchiks found it suitable. Such a paradigm shift is extremely important because it deconstructs both the common among historians of Stalinism usage of the term ethnic operations and banal explanation of the murders conducted by the Soviets who allegedly were conducting the liquidation of the fifth column, which is simply not true. Because if we accept this still existing paradigm, if we accept this paradigm change, the question arises why the Soviet system applied genocidal action only against Poles and why Soviet used only severe repression against Germans, who even without the post-factum knowledge about Second World War were the real threat to the Soviets. This paradigm shift tells us to trace completely other motives in the actions against the Poles from those giving rise to the repression directed against Germans. At the same time, it composed the question about the motives of the top Soviet management of DEF, ordering to carry out anti-Polish crimes, and also the motive of contractors on the very low level, who in the case of Poles have done whatever they could to obey the order 00485 so strictly, to the level of regular genocide, which in the case of other nationalities did not happen. Finally, this paradigm change forced us to understand Soviet Great Terror not as mainly inter-system cleansing, and it was popular 20 years ago, and is still alive in the perspective of some eminent scholars, but simply as a genocide organized by the Communist Party, mainly against kulaks on the social level and against Poles on the ethnic level. I think that actually it is a major paradigm shift for this such tragical period of the history of USSR. So this is the first aspect, this paradigm change. I understand Great Terror as chain of murders directed mainly against kulaks and secondly against Poles, or other actions were also carried on, but on a definitely smaller scale. So the second aspect, which is the result of my research, is treating the so-called purge of the Polish Communist Party in 1937 as a myth. The presented in my book sequence of events proves also clearly that the career of the concept of cleansing of Communist Party of Poland is far too great in relation to its actual rank. The fact is, of course, that the first confirmed both by the sources and witnesses information about the anti-Polish actions of the Soviet authorities, which were presented by the historians, were associated with the tragic fate of the CPP activists in the years 1937-1938. Out of lack of knowledge about the Polish context of the Great Terror was born the idea that the rulers of the USSR conducted a special cleansing of Communist Party of Poland. None of the researchers could not, however, explain the phenomenon of the purges, the reasons for which it was carried out. Some researchers used to explain this phenomena, which is completely absurd out of context, basing on the Stalinist need to eliminate the potential fifth column, but such an interpretation makes no sense at all, not mentioning the fact that officials and members of the CPP were in reality fifth column, but of the Soviets in Poland. So one could guess, but never before did, that behind CPP execution stood factor independent from the current political meaning. Factor, I can say, much more archetypical, which from the point of view of the Soviet authorities prevailed. This X factor and real reason why Polish communists were executed was simply their Polish origin. Let's try for a moment to think as a Soviet persecutor who wants to hunt down Poles. Where he is going to start this hunting? Of course, in close range, among his own society, among Poles whom he knows from mass media, if not personally. And, what is obvious, he knows only Polish communists, especially from CPP. So he starts from CPP, not because he has some special objections about this organization, but because it is simply the closest group of Poles, which is also easy to hunt down. It simply means that Polish communists were killed not as Polish communists, but just as the Poles. Why one could guess that if it is so, similarly, this kind of close-range repression must have been also applied also to all others Poles functioning at the top of Soviet society. And yes, indeed, in the light of the facts, it was. Firstly, Poles were kicked off and exterminated from NKVD, from the Red Army and the Soviet ruling party. At the same time, repressions were directed against Soviet scientists and artists of Polish origin. So it is no wonder that finally
See, jet lag.
So it is no wonder that finally the general process involved also the CPP, but what is easy to understand, only at the very end of the anti-Polish actions preceding the commencement of Polish operation itself. I would argue then that cleansing of the CPP as a separate event of a special significance resulting from any particular circumstances simply never happened. It was just one of the steps in the way of systematical extermination of Poles in all possible environments, also associated with Soviet power and administration, and for Soviets, environment of the CPP was particularly well known and easy to remove, which was quickly made between March and August of 1937. Characteristically, Stalin decided to disclose the CPP solution not until more than a year after the actual decision in this case was made. He did so not because he was particularly ashamed of this cleansing, but just because he wanted to hide her true motives. He just didn't want to make any impression that dissolving of the CPP is directly associated with a Polish operation. But in fact, it was an integral, but not special part of it. Thus, this interpretation is confirmed by the fact that at the turn of June and July of 1937, which is just before the Polish operation, the NKVD tried to fabricate at least 4 paths of Polish conspiracy in his own bosom, inside the Red Army, in the main Soviet Communist Party, and finally in CPP. All those paths were the part of overwhelming Polish military organization conspiracy. So CPP case was only one of the many Polish fronts, and there is only one factor which united all process: Polish origins of individuals involved in the persecution and soon doomed to death. The third aspect, which is also very visible in the documents concerning Polish operation, is a special treatment of Poles, which could be understood as very similar to the Nuremberg laws, which were introduced a little bit earlier in Germany. In the literature, there is often underlined that not only Poles were murdered in the Polish operation, and in some publications we can find estimation of the number of true Poles which were killed. 2 years ago, I presented in here similar estimation from Belarus. Of course, in some way this kind of analysis is justified, but not in the way in which it is presented by eminent Sovietologists. The basic criterion of nationality recognized by those historians is the declaration made by the individuals to the NKVD agents during arrest. This declaration was noted in the official documentation, and it is the basis of mentioned above estimations. Such a declaration, however, in the case of the Poles, who as an ethnic group were subjected to repression from the end of 1920s, is misleading. Polish national, knowing that their Polishness would constitute a real threat to their life, simply very often prefer not to give true declaration of their origins, because to present themselves to Russian in subjectively safer way. For this reason, the number of the people admitting to Polish origins in the years 1926, 1937 decreased by almost 200,000. However, the authorities, which of course quickly spotted this tendency, had their own ways to assess who is really a Pole and who is not, and recognized as Poles also people who were denying such ethnic origins. In other words, the Soviet authorities, similarly to the situation in Germany, developed their original way to decide who is who. The only difference was that in Germans, those methods was officially established in the shape of Nuremberg laws. It is important to understand that in Germany the Jews has also obvious tendency to hide their origins. And the Nuremberg laws was a remedy for such a tendency. What kind of criteria was used by the Soviet rulers to establish who is really of Polish origins and who is not? Three of them are of the most importance. First, place of birth. It was assumed that a person born in the wider Poland is of Polish origins. Second is the name. It was assumed that a man wearing a Polish name is of Polish origins. And finally, religion. It was assumed that individual who is both a Slav and a Catholic is of Polish origins. Applying these criteria, of course, have led to inclusion to the Polish operation some people who really had rather accidental connection to Polishness, but from the other hand, the bulk of those who denied their Polish origins and nevertheless were persecuted during Polish operation were in reality of Polish origins. Of course, they were the Poles in the wide sense, in which, for example, Jewish communists from CPP who were born and raised in Poland and were using Polish language every day, and, what is important, felt the need to function in Polish and not some other communist party, were also the Poles. To sum up, the nationality of the individuals those days in Soviet Union was determined by the authority, and the subjective individual feelings were of secondary importance. The same situation was in Germany, where even in the case of Jews, thoroughly assimilated to German identity for generations, who often do not have the slightest suspicions of their true origins, were recognized as Jews, because it was the state who decided whether someone was a Jew or not. It must be recognized that the Soviet authorities also knew better, and all the victims of anti-Polish actions were, from the point of view of Soviet rulers, just the Poles. To underline ex post that non-Poles were widely among the people lost as Poles has obviously some cognitive significance, but explains very little from the actual motives of Soviet authorities, and could be simply misleading. In other words, the Soviets did not associate deliberately non-Poles in the Polish operation, as it is suggested, because essentially develop a fairly common sense criteria for determining who is a real Pole, and in terms of these criteria, all of the murdered were, from the point of view of Soviet power, just the Poles. Similarly, in the case of the Holocaust, one can wonder now how many real Jews and how many non-Jews died, which does not change the fact that from the point of view of German authorities, all of the victims were simply Jews. And the fourth, the last aspect from those which I want to present today is the situation of Poles in the Soviet Union. I'm simply asking the question: was the enemy in the Soviet Union a Pole? The story of the Soviet anti-Polish actions presented in my book, interpreted by me as a special sui generis, raises the question of the special status of Poles in the Soviet Union in the interwar period, which finally led to the genocide. Described events clearly shows that indeed the Poles in a certain period had such a special status and become one of the enemies of the Soviet state, and what is important, the only ethnic enemy. And the Soviets were very eager to get rid of all those enemies. This anti-Polish chain of deeds in the period between 1931 and 1941 started from the first collective expulsions of Poles from their native land in Soviet Belarus and Soviet Ukraine, and ended with the German attack on the USSR. Incubator of that status was the time of collectivization and the second wave of atheism from the early 1930s, which the Poles resisted relatively in the hardest way. This resistance, combined with the stereotypes about Poles, inherited from a time before the October Revolt, led gradually to enroot in the minds of Soviet policymakers understandable belief that the Poles are behind all the possible pathologies that, in their opinion, existed in the Soviet Union, and that their harmful activities, sabotage and espionage would finally destroy the Soviet Union. The loop on the neck of Poles in the USSR began to tighten in 1935. This process started with the second period of displacement of Polish peasants, this time mainly to Kazakhstan, which lasted until December 1936. At the same time, Soviets, as I showed before, began to liquidate the remnants of Polish autonomy, both territorial and in the field of education and culture. A year later, the cleansing of Poles occupying important position in the Soviet structure started, which were lauded by the inventing one of the most serious anti-Soviet conspiracy, the conspiracy of Polish military organization. It was then when, on the canvas of numerous earlier accusations of espionage brought against the Poles, began to mature the concept according to which Poles have created a major national anti-Soviet conspiracy, which was leading to the overthrowing of Soviet Communist Party and murdering the whole communist ruling class headed by the Stalin himself. And of course to re-establish the Polish border from the year 1772. According to this concept, every Pole would have been or simply was a participant of this conspiracy. The logical conclusion of such a concept in Soviet realm was actually genocide commitment
genocide committed by the Soviet authorities on Poles, officially to disarm and liquidate pan-Soviet Polish military organization conspiracy, and in fact, ultimately solving the Polish question in the USSR. Although the Great Terror ended in November 1938, this attitude towards Poles were living further. That is why, less than a year later, a similar, though with a slightly different character, action has been taken against the Poles from the territories taken away from the Second Republic in 1939. Pole was still the enemy. The peak of anti-Polish Soviet hysteria took place in the years 1937-1938. It is not coincidence that exactly then the Soviets began to produce anti-Polish films, which are very similar to works of, for example, Veit Harlan, the famous author of Jew Zeus, which is a movie released in 1940, just the same time when the most important anti-Polish Soviet films were released. Of course, the Pole was not the only enemy in Soviet Union, but he was an enemy the easiest to recognize and thereby to catch. And this is the principal reason why the history of Polish nationals in Soviet Union was so tragic.
All right, great. Just a couple of comments before I take a couple of questions, or Tomasz will field a couple of questions. You wouldn't believe it, but we got a hold of Politburo records from the 1920s and 30s. The paranoia was unbelievable. Guess who the main enemy was? These are closed meetings, so they didn't have to pretend. Who was the greatest power in the world? Well, the most evil power was, of course, Great Britain. It was a global power. But number two, so the greatest threat to the Soviet Union. This is closed Politburo meetings. Poland! Poland was about to invade. Yes. This went on until more or less 1934 and 5. Then they produced their tractor, which became Tank T-34. And in the Politburo meetings, they became visibly relaxed about that mighty monster next door called Poland. Now, Poland was even more of a threat than Japan.
And Germany.
And Germany, yes. Oh no, Germany was a friend. They were testing tanks together, jumping out of planes and stuff. They really loved each other for a long time. It is unbelievable and uncanny. We like to make Polish jokes and say it really doesn't matter. No, no, no. The only time in history that the Red Army was defeated in the field, it was in 1920 and the Poles did it. Nobody else. With some help from American flyers and a few French troops who were there illegally. Engaged. I'm sorry?
What about the Ukrainians?
Yes, well then we can add the Tartars and others who fought in the armies of the Commonwealth. Yes, but the Ukrainians didn't make that much of a difference. They certainly couldn't make much of a difference in their own country because nobody really wanted to fight. People were tired and people just gave up. But the Poles did make a difference and that made a lasting impression, especially since Stalin occupied a very important position in the Southern Front under Buziony. So he took it personally. He got trounced and resented it. There was a famous, and it functions until this very day, a famous Soviet and Russian stereotype, Polish lords. When in 1939, 1940, 1941, the Soviets were deporting Polish citizens. They would oftentimes from Eastern Poland, that's when Stalin and Hitler were best friends, they would refer to Polish lords all the time. Why? Well, if you're polite, you wash your hands, then you must be a lord. That means anybody who had a mom or who was taught at home to maintain a standard of hygiene. And it may sound funny, because it did sound funny to the victims too. Oh my God, everybody is a lord. No, I'm a farmer actually. I'm a worker. I'm still going to the gulag. Oh yes, because you're a Polish lord. This was a term of opprobrium used quite frequently. And as Tomek said, it's oftentimes very hard to discern. Because when the Nazis said a Jew, to stigmatize somebody, their definition of Jewishness was even more flexible than an ultra-Orthodox. Everybody who has a Jewish mother is Jewish. No, the Nazis classified if you were 1/4 Jew. If you were in the SS, they had to go back to the 17th century to check your background. Stalin essentially decided that, and here's a quote, he told de Gaulle, this is what he said in front of de Gaulle, once a Pole, always a Pole. So you had a bunch of people who had been completely Russified. So you know, the Dostoevsky family, for instance, was Polish nobility, but they were Polish nobility in the 16th century. After the 18th century, they became Russified, and there's no better great Russian chauvinist than Dostoevsky, as you all know. Yes. So Stalin would consider his descendants to be Polish. It was quite ironic, because not only some were Russified, but there were people born in Poland and who grew up Polish, but they became communists. People like Gomulka back in the 20s and 30s did not consider themselves Poles, or they didn't consider themselves anything. They would say, we're Soviets, we're communists. It's a completely different mentality. We shed this reactionary identity of being called an ethnic group or a religious group. We're now free because we're communists. So it's a completely different nationality. People would say, oh yes, my father was Polish, I'm a Soviet. By this, they didn't mean a Soviet citizen. They meant Soviet mentality. I'm a communist, this is my new identity. There is nothing beyond it. And they were shot, to their great surprise, as Poles. You know, look at Jewish communists. They denied they were Jewish, they denied they were communists, and they hated to use the word Polish. In fact, when Stalin set up his underground in Poland in 1941, August, he said, let's revive the Communist Party, but we won't call it Communist Party, we'll call it Polish Workers' Party. First he wanted to call it Polish Labor Party, then he changed his mind, Polish Workers' Party. Underground communists in Poland refused to join. They thought it was some kind of a fascist provocation because it had a name, Polish Workers' Party. And how would you be a communist and call yourself Polish or Jewish or any ethnic or national group? That was against communism. It violated their mentality. It didn't matter at all. They were all slaughtered in the Polish operation of the NKVD because Comrade Stalin decided to be ultra flexible in his definition. By the way, what Tomek has discovered completely falls under the rubric of Raphael Lemkin's definition of genocide. It was also a democide, as Professor Rommel calls it, which means mass killing for political purposes. And that accommodates both ethnic killing and non-ethnic killing. In practice, as you'll see, we will not discover oftentimes, in practice in history, we will not discover a pure case of persecution. Even there were over 100,000 Germans of Jewish origin fighting in the Wehrmacht. Brian Mark Riggs discovered that, and everybody was shocked. Why? You know, people assimilate, people intermarry. One would have to be a crazy totalitarian to start differentiating like this. Oh, I'm sorry, Stalin and Hitler were crazy totalitarians. What am I talking about? 2 questions for Dr. Sommer, please. Sir.
Okay, so this is maybe a little bit ill-formed as a question, but I would like you, if you could, to put a little bit of color in the documents that you use. So you mentioned during your talk the 00485, and then there was also this very illuminating discussion of you know the statements, the personal statements on what ethnicity I am and how those shifted over time, and this was a natural reaction to find your own definition, because that no longer becomes those documents no longer become very useful or as useful. What with the NKVD apparatus, could you just talk a little bit on the documentary proof of how they executed this, how procedurally we can see this in the documents? Sort of just, I mean, pick the highlights, pick some top level and slightly lower level ones.
I can show you a graph. Unfortunately, it's in Polish, but with small help of Marek, we try to translate how it worked. But wait a moment, I must.
Yes.
Because actually it was quite complicated how it worked, so to understand it, it was not so easy.
Almost everything was convoluted, for it overlapped, and there were simultaneously issued documents and various bureaucracies working seemingly in concert and seemingly at cross purposes. Various nomenclature was put together, so it's like unscrambling a maze. So the question is very pertinent that you're asking.
This is the outline of Great Terror. And here we have action, and here we have instances which were making those actions. So first part is cleansing.
So the purge, sorry?
Purge. The purge. Cleansing in part
mass operations and other operations.
and other. Put aside the other, let's say, material of other operations for minor criminals.
He says criminals as in common crime. However, one of the first purges which resulted in mass slaughter occurred already during the NEP. It was against so-called currency speculators. So if you were a rabbi who had a few bucks to help your congregation, you would be a currency speculator, and you would then fall under the criminal code and be shot with a Catholic priest or an Orthodox priest, you see. But there were real currency speculators too, who would be shot together with people who were not currency speculators, but they did have currency. So that is also very flexible, and it needs to be disentangled. Because otherwise you would think that many people in religious congregations were simply rip-off artists with hard currency. And they were not.
And in the middle we have mass operations. There were special orders which were made on the level of NKVD, but were let's say, constructed in Politburo and sent to NKVD. NKVD put the idea into shape. And the shape was...
so the Politburo would discuss an issue
yes.
and say, comrades, this is what we have to do. And then...
For example, what to do with the Poles. And they decide, let's kill the members of Polish military operation.
Yes,
yes?
This is what the Politburo would say. And then the NKVD would come up with a form. With a format, including the legal aspect.
And the format was an order. The orders were, as in every bureaucracy, numbered. So 00447 is the biggest mass operation. It's a kulak operation. It takes...
The kulak operation, which means supposedly rich farmers. If you had a cow and could hire one guy, then you were an enemy of the people. And the kulaks, yes. The kulak operation.
They killed at least 100,000 kulaks. And
this is, we're talking 1935?
No, 37,
1937, because they were deported in 30.
Yes, before yes.
Yeah.
This is the other story, not connected.
Not connected.
Great story.
It's superseded collectivization. This is 1937, the slaughter of the remnant of the kulaks who were either in forced exile or in the gulag. They were put on the list and by order of the Politburo, but then the NKVD had to set up the framework, legal framework, which would take the shape of the 00447 order.
And the second biggest mass operation was Polish Operation
I think
004.
Tomek has 10 copies of his book, which he loved. They're very heavy.
And the second biggest operation was 00485, and it was against Polish,
The Poles.
the Polish nationals. There were also about 10 other smaller mass operations, but if we are comparing the number of people killed in those operations were smaller than the number of people which were killed in Polish operation, and much smaller than in Gulag operations. Altogether, it took life of about 1 million people, 1.5% of Soviet population in 13 months. So what kind of documents we have? We have a decision from Politburo sent to NKVD. We have orders made by NKVD, and those orders were sent to regional NKVD bureaus. For example, to I don't know, Sverdlovsk district or Moskva district, Leningrad district. And they were making their own local law, how to operate on the local level. And after that they were reporting to NKVD, and NKVD were reporting to Politburo.
Would you mind showing my favorite picture of the shooters?
It's, maybe I show in the end because it's
At the end,
other,
yes.
you know.
Okay. Now this is
Yes.
really worth looking at. They took souvenir pictures like the SS. And
So
so
anyway,
we have one. We
so-
got one.
So anyway, they produce massive documentation. To make this book, I have read, I think, about 5,000 documents. Part of those documents I've read in this machine style because they are digitalized.
Typed up.
Typed up.
On the typewriter.
They were some of them were digitalized, and they are in such a shape that I was able to search through using some keywords and checking. For example, I was putting Polish, Poles, Polish operation, and I was checking what is going on because it's really not easy to read every letter of such big documentation.
Optical character recognition. They were transformed through optical character recognition,
Yeah.
and
Yes.
you could do that. I
Yes.
see. Yes.
And of course, I found also some documents which were not used before. I was cooperating with Memorial, so I think that document basis for this work was really big. I was reading it for 2 years, so it was not an easy task, especially time-consuming task. Yes. And comparing, for example, to documentation of German Socialist National Party, the documentation, Soviet documentation, is much more bigger, and all the secret operations were also very strictly documented. In Germany, we have still, for example, no written order of Adolf Hitler known, letting some factors to start the Holocaust. It simply does not exist.
You don't have it yet.
Or in case of Soviet Union, we have all documents signed personally by Stalin. And we have also the reports which were sent from NKVD to Stalin with the notes of Stalin, who was, for example, underline something or saying this should be how I should understand this or something like that.
No, he would, sometimes he would make a note, beat him up because he's not talking enough.
Even so, this
He would
kind
make
of
a
notes.
note and return it to the NKVD, beat him up, which means he really was paying attention, even to torture.
There was a very nice time in Soviet Union, in Russia, in the beginning of the 90s, where the archives were open and you were able to just go and, if you have some cash, buy those documents. Now it's over, so...
You can ask, there's a witness to back me up, someone who went to Moscow, Mrs. Romerstein, except you have to know, they try to oftentimes to sell you inferior products that they made up on old typewriters. And Professor Romerstein was always able to tell what was valuable or not. It was an art, but we had a window of about 10 years and hardly anybody was interested. Meaning we had no funds, we could have had almost anything. And it's all on our own dime, so support the Institute of World Politics. It's tax deductible. Okay.
And what is, only one more remark, what is very strange about Soviet system, maybe natural on the other hand, that they were doing every operation in a little bit different mood. For example, the people from Red Army were persecuted by military courts. For NKVD and party, Communist Party, there was a special body, war collegium.
Well, a military board.
A military board.
Not a court, but a board.
This military board was traveling through the Soviet Union and made special session to, for example, clean the situation in, I don't know, Kiev or somewhere.
Yeah.
There was also special inventory mode.
Okay, so the way it was booked, as in
Yes. It was a special
spisowy.
spiskowy. Rozpisać, no to jest rozpisać. Spis.
Spis, yeah. Okay. So the
Stalin invented a special way to
the booking mode.
the booking mode. He invented special mode of registration mode, maybe.
Registration mode.
A special way of murdering of murdering the people whom he personally dislike. So he, for example, made a list. No, album is a different story. He made a list, and with, for example, 300 names, and they were to be killed instantly. So he was sending this list to this
special registration list of people to be handled and processed faster than the usual bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's the fast track. They were
He was
fast track.
sending it to this collegium, military
Board.
to military board to make those decisions more, let's say, more efficient and instant. Yes, and instant. And it was not. He was making those registers for a year, and in this mode, about 20,000 people were killed.
There was also a method where there were killers from behind the desk. Even, I mean, we talked about Daneke or Eichmann, people who did logistics. Well, Tomek found at least 3 officers who were just cooped up in an office with files, and they were checking them off. Once they checked off the files, people were shot. And they were doing it back in a factory. 8 hours a day,
Yes,
checking off, checking off.
and there was a special.
So everything was legal. Mass murder was legal. Everybody was on the list. Everybody was checked off. The Soviet law was followed. You can't accuse the communists of not being very law-oriented. So,
And there was a special invention for Kulak's Troika, so-called Kulak Troika, which operate on kulaks, and also special invention, the commission of NKVD and prosecutor general, it means Mr. Wyszyński and Mr. Jeżow, and they were deciding the
okay.
Polish question. So, and of course, on the level of execution of all those instructions, it was one big misunderstanding, and for example, the administration from the local level were not sure how to operate. So, for example, Poles were murdered on this special Polish way, but also via those troikas, also on this registered mode and also military board. So, you know, to understand how it operates, it's a big work, and
they
someone
also
should know all the
military courts too, because there
yes.
was Poles in the Soviet military. Anyway, let's show the picture because we've really
Okay, the picture
we've
is,
really violated.
Mr. Styrna.
Mr. Styrna will hate us.
Na tym jest takie zdjęcie. Foty 3. Foty 3.
While you're doing that, can I make a suggestion since my question took off a little bit? Do you know about crowdsourcing? First of all, you need your book translated to English, obviously, but that's a stupid comment. What you should do is you should give the task of Polish school children to go over some of these thousands of documents and translate them all into English. And then you can start to learn about what actually went on, and you take a part of history, and you don't forget about, you know, this evil.
First, they would have to be translated into the Polish.
Okay.
We'd have to get
Russian
Russian
children,
children, and now Russian children are involved in cyber attacks against the
The Russians are
Pentagon.
interested.
So, on behalf
Yeah,
of
okay.
Putin,
To mam tylko takie przepisy, te dobre zdjęcia. To są ci
There's
wykonawcy,
a-
ale to
I have
wyższego
a
stylu.
picture upstairs. At any rate, there's a bunch of shooters, some of whom have 2 or 3 watches on their hands. Because they were showing off rewards. If you killed 30,000 people, you got a watch. It was a bonus. So we have a picture like this. I'll try to find it. I have it upstairs tonight.
It's somewhere in the
But there you go.
Those are upper officers,
There.
upper level.
Okay. All right.
They are very dedicated to their work. So thank you very much.
Thank you.